What was Earth like during the Ice Age? Documentary for Sleep. Asterisk, a contemplative journey through the lost worlds of the Pleistocene asterisk. In the quietude of this evening hour, as shadows lengthen across familiar fields and the last light of day surrenders to approaching night, we stand upon ground that holds secrets ancient beyond our wildest imaginings. Beneath your feet, beneath these very stones and soil, lie the compressed memories of a world so different from ours that it might as well have existed on another planet. 20,000 years ago, a mere whisper in geological time, this peaceful countryside lay buried beneath ice sheets kilometers thick. Imagine, if you will, glacier towering higher than our tallest cathedrals, stretching endlessly toward horizons that knew no summer. The silence was different then. Not the comfortable quiet of evening, but the profound hush of a world held in winter's eternal embrace. A silence so complete it could swallow the beating of your own heart. What was it like, this earth of ice and shadow? What dreams stirred in the frozen soil? What songs did the wind sing when it was the only voice for thousands of miles? Tonight, we journey backward through time's frozen corridors to walk amongst giants and witness wonders that sleep now only in stone and memory. Time, for us, is measured in heartbeats and seasons, in the brief span between sunrise and sunset. But the earth breathes to a different rhythm, vast, patient, measured in millennia rather than moments. Our planet dances through space in cycles so grand that entire civilizations rise and fall between one movement and the next. Every 100,000 years, the Earth's orbit shifts just slightly, a cosmic waltz that determines whether continents bask in warmth or sleep beneath ice. 26,000 years ago, during what we call the last glacial maximum, our world tilted just a fraction away from the sun's embrace. It was enough. Like a breath held too long, the planet began to cool. Snow fell and did not melt. Autumn forgot to give way to spring. The Ice Age did not arrive like a storm, sudden and violent. Instead, it whispered its way across the world with the patience of geology itself. Year by year, decade by decade, winter extended its stay until it became not a season, but a way of being. Each snowflake that refused to melt became part of something greater, a growing prayer of ice that would eventually reshape entire continents. In this patient transformation, we glimpse something profound about time itself, how the grandest changes often come not through catastrophe, but through the gentle persistence of countless small moments. And so the world became ice, and ice became time, and time became a meditation that lasted 20,000 years. In the high places where mountains pierced the sky, snow began to dream of becoming something more. Layer upon layer, season after season, the accumulating crystals whispered secrets to one another in languages older than words. Watch how snow becomes Neve, how Neve becomes Finn, how Finn surrenders its individual crystals to become the flowing, living substance we call ice. This is not mere physics. This is alchemy, the transformation of countless ephemeral moments into geological permanence. The great ice sheets were not built in haste. They moved across the landscape reading a text written in animal tracks, plant distribution, wind patterns, and the subtle signs that indicated water, shelter, or danger. Their literacy was not in symbols on parchment, but in the living language of the earth itself. When hunting, they demonstrated a form of intelligence that transcended individual consciousness, moving together like a single organism, each person anticipating the actions of the others, communicating through gestures so subtle they seemed telepathic. The creation of fire in such conditions was not technology but magic, the transformation of friction and tinder into the gift that made human life possible in the Ice Age world. Each flame was a small miracle, a victory over the fundamental hostility of their environment. Yet even in the harshest conditions, they found time for beauty. They decorated their tools, painted their caves, carved figures that served no apparent survival function except to feed some essential human need for meaning, for connection to something larger than mere existence. Even sleep was a form of alertness. These people slept lightly, always partially aware of their environment, ready to respond to changes in weather, the approach of predators, or the opportunities that might arise from the constant dance of survival. With each dawn, there began again the ancient ritual of reading the world, making the countless small decisions that meant the difference between life and death, carrying forward through their survival the genetic and cultural inheritance that would eventually become us. Even in the depths of Earth's longest winter, the planet's molten heart continued to beat, sending pulses of fire and ash toward the surface and eruptions that reminded the frozen world that beneath all ice lay an ocean of liquid stone, patient and eternal. Where volcanic heat met glacial ice, the very elements seemed to sing, the sharp hiss of water becoming steam, the deep crack of ice expanding too rapidly, the rumble of earth being born from a marriage of fire and cold. Volcanic ash drifted across the Ice Age world like dark snow, carrying within each particle the mineral essence of deep earth. This was not destruction but creation, each grain a seed of future soil, each ashfall an investment in landscapes yet to be born. The great herbivores, normally so patient and unhurried, would quicken their pace when volcanic ash began to fall, their ancient instincts warning them of dangers their conscious minds could not understand. Yet they did not flee in panic but moved with purpose toward shelters their species had used for generations during similar events. When major eruptions sent ash high into the atmosphere, they created volcanic winters that could last for years, temporary coolings that added their own signature to the already complex climate patterns of the Ice Age. These were not catastrophes but variations in the Earth's ongoing symphony of change. Around active volcanic areas, the Earth offered gifts of warmth, hot springs that remained liquid even in the deepest cold, steam vents that created microclimates where subtropical plants might survive at Arctic latitudes, islands of warmth in oceans of cold. Animals discovered these thermal oases and incorporated them into their survival strategies. Mammoths would wade into warm springs to clean their fur and ease the ache of cold bones, while smaller creatures made permanent homes in the heated cave that volcanic activity created. When volcanic particles high in the atmosphere encountered the aurora borealis, they created light shows beyond imagination, colors that had no name because no eye had adequate vocabulary for such beauty, dancing curtains of green and gold and rose that painted the entire dome of sky. Volcanic eruptions scattered across the landscape materials that would prove invaluable to Ice Age peoples. Obsidian sharper than modern surgical steel. Volcanic glass that could be knapped into tools of incredible precision, pumice for abrading hides and shaping wood. In the aftermath of eruptions, the pattern of life's return was both predictable and miraculous. First came the pioneer species. Plants and small animals adapted to colonize disturbed ground. Then, gradually, the full complexity of Ice Age ecosystems would reassemble itself in the mineral-rich volcanic soils. Over geological time, these volcanic events created some of the most fertile soils the world has ever known. The ash that seemed destructive in the moment became the foundation for grasslands so rich they could support herds of megafauna in numbers that stagger the imagination. Years or decades after major eruptions, these areas often became centers of abundance, places where the marriage of fire and ice had created conditions so perfect for life that they drew animals from hundreds of miles away, making them natural gathering points for the nomadic peoples of the Ice Age world. Across the endless grasslands and through the corridors between ice sheets moved rivers of life, migration so vast, so perfectly synchronized with seasonal rhythms, that they seemed less like animal behavior than manifestations of the Earth's own breathing, the planet's pulse made visible in flesh and movement. Follow these caribou as they trace routes older than human civilization, paths worn into the tundra by millions of hooves over hundreds of thousands of years. Their movement is not random wandering but precise navigation, following ancestral highways that connect summer feeding grounds to winter shelter with the accuracy of a cosmic calendar. Look into their eyes and see something beyond mere instinct, a form of consciousness attuned to magnetic fields, atmospheric pressure, the subtle cues that allow navigation across featureless landscapes. They carry within their cells a compressed wisdom of countless generations, genetic maps more accurate than any human cartography. From above, these migrations resembled rivers of living matter flowing across the continent, hundreds of thousands, sometimes millions of animals moving as a single organism, their collective movement creating its own weather patterns, its own ecological effect that rippled across the landscape. Shadowing these great movements came the predators, dire wolves, saber-toothed cats, cave lions, not hunting indiscriminately, performing their role as editors of the genetic text that would become the next generation. Ice Age horses, smaller and hardier than the modern descendants, moved in herds that created thunder across the grasslands. Their hoofbeats were the percussion section in the great symphony of migration, a rhythm that could be felt in the ground for miles, announcing their passage to every creature within hearing. American bison, larger and more numerous than their descendants, moved in herds so vast they created their own weather, clouds of dust that could be seen from beyond the horizon, temporary thunderstorms generated by the friction of millions of hooves against prairie grass. River crossings were the most dangerous moments of these migrations, when flowing herds met flowing water and the mathematics of survival played out in real time. Yet even here, the animals demonstrated collective intelligence, with leaders testing currents and followers adjusting their crossing points based on the success or failure of those ahead. The migrations did not stop with sunset. Under star-filled skies, the great herds continued their movement, guided by celestial navigation systems that connected them not just to their landscape but to the cosmos itself. The sound of millions of animals moving at night created a continuous whisper that seemed to emerge from the earth itself. At certain times and places, these separate migrations would converge, creating temporary cities of animals, calving grounds where hundreds of thousands of young were born within weeks of each other, feeding areas where different species graze in carefully structured hierarchies that minimize competition and maximize the efficiency of resource use. Ice Age peoples lived within this system, not as external predators but as integrated components of the migration network. They followed the herds, predicted their movements, positioned themselves as strategic crossing points and bottlenecks where successful hunts could provide food for extended periods. These migrations were not annual events but multi-generational patterns that connected individual animals to cycles larger than any single lifetime. An animal born in one season might not return to its birthplace for several years, yet would find its way there with perfect precision when the time was right. In the flowing movements of these great herds, we see reflected something profound about life itself, that individual existence gains meaning through participation in patterns larger than the self, that navigation through life requires both individual consciousness and collective wisdom, and that the journey itself, not the destination, is what transforms migration from mere movement into something approaching the sacred. At the margins where ice met sea, where the solid dreams of millennia encountered the liquid memory of oceans, the earth performed its most spectacular poetry, the carving of glacier, moments when frozen time returned to flowing water in explosions of sound and spray that seemed to shake the very foundations of the world. Watch this moment of transformation. Tons of ice that are pressed together for thousands of years suddenly surrendering to gravity and the patient pull of tidal forces. Each carving event is both an ending and a beginning, the death of ice and the birth of a floating mountain that will carry the essence of ancient snow to distant seas. The sound is beyond description, deeper than thunder, more resonant than cathedral bells, a note that seems to emerge from the planet's core and reverberate through water and air and bone. It is a voice of geological time made audible, the earth singing its own transformation. Once freed from their glacial matrix, these icebergs become wanderers, drifting on currents that connect polar seas to tropical waters. Each iceberg is a messenger from the Ice Age, carrying within its crystalline structure the compressed atmosphere of ancient winters, samples of air that once filled the lungs of mammoths. Beneath the surface lies the iceberg's hidden poetry, vast chambers and tunnels carved by the slow circulation of meltwater, cathedrals of ice that exist in eternal twilight, visited only by seals and arctic fish that find in these frozen palaces a different kind of sanctuary. Where glacier met resistance from mountains or encountered other ice sheets, they created formations of surreal beauty. Pressure ridges where ice buckled and folded like the Earth's crust in miniature, seracs that towered like frozen waterfalls, crevasses that opened into the glacier's heart like windows into deep time. Even on the glacier's surface, water found ways to flow. Meltwater streams trace meandering paths across the ice, creating temporary pools of stunning blue intensity, carving channels that changed daily as the ice shifted and flowed beneath the summer sun. Most mysterious of all were the glacial mills, perfectly circular holes where meltwater disappeared into the ice, spiraling down through vertical shafts that penetrated to the glacier's base. Standing at the edge of such a mill, one could hear the water singing its descent into darkness, a liquid lament that seemed to carry all the loneliness of the Ice Age world. When the aurora borealis danced above the ice sheets, the entire landscape became a mirror of cosmic fire. The ice reflected and refracted the northern lights, creating ground-level auroras that seemed to rise from the snow itself, transforming the polar landscape into something that seemed more otherworldly than terrestrial. Wind and ice together created sculptures that would have challenged human artists. Sastrugi formations where persistent winds carved the snow into wave-like patterns that stretched to the horizon. Natural ice sculptures that took form so perfect they seemed intentional. Expressions of an aesthetic sense built into the very physics of crystallization. Over longer timescales, the ice revealed its fluid nature. flowing like water but in geological time, streaming around mountains and through valleys, creating and destroying its own formations in a slow dance that connected seasons to centuries to millennia. Yet perhaps the most profound aspect of the ice sheets was their silence, not emptiness but a fullness of quiet so complete it seemed to have weight. In such silence, consciousness itself seemed to expand, to become more aware of its own nature, to touch something eternal in the temporary vessel of individual awareness. Standing on these vast ice sheets, surrounded by horizons that seemed to curve beyond the edge of the world, Ice Age peoples experience a form of solitude that modern humans can barely imagine. Not loneliness, but a profound connection to the essential emptiness that underlies all form, the silence from which all sounds emerge and to which they eventually return. In certain protected valleys where the ice's reach softened to suggestion rather than dominion, stood guardians more ancient than any human civilization. Trees that had been young when the first ice sheets began to form, that had witnessed the entire drama of the Ice Age unfold in their slow-motion perception of time. Touch this bark and feel the accumulated wisdom of millennia. Each groove, each ridge tells a story of seasons survived, of storms weathered, of the patient alchemy that transforms sunlight and soil into the substance of permanence. This is living history, consciousness extended across timescales that dwarf human experience. In these rings lies a library more complete than any written record, the autobiography of climate written in cellulose and lignin. Here, narrow bands record years when volcanic ash dimmed the sun. There, wider rings celebrate decades of perfect growing conditions. Each ring is a page, each tree a volume in the Earth's unwritten encyclopedia. Beneath the soil extends another network, root systems so vast and interconnected that individual trees become part of a larger organism, sharing nutrients, communicating chemical messages, creating a wood wide web that connects forest consciousness across acres of apparently separate trees. In partnership with fungal networks that stretch for miles beneath the forest floor, these ancient trees participate in conversations conducted in chemical languages, sharing not just resources but information. Warnings of insect attacks, news of changing weather patterns, the botanical equivalent of a nervous system that spans entire ecosystems. Some trees bore the scars of lightning strikes from centuries past, spiral grooves that trace down their trunks like frozen energy, wounds that had healed into distinctive patterns that marked these giants as survivors not just of time but of cosmic intervention. These oldest trees served as hotels for countless generations of animals. Woodpeckers carved nesting cavities that became homes for families of squirrels, owls, and martins. Bears made winter dens in the hollow trunks, while countless smaller creatures found in the complex architecture of these giants entire worlds of ecological opportunity. The seeds of these ancient trees carried within them genetic information that spanned ice ages, adaptations to conditions that existed before the glacier, resilience to climate changes that played out over geological time. Each seed was a time capsule, a message sent from the deep past toward an unknown future. Through countless seasons, these guardians had watched the world transform around them. They had seen species appear and disappear, had provided shelter for creatures now extinct, had dropped their leaves on soil that had never known human footprints. In winter, loaded with snow, they became sculptures of such profound dignity that they seemed less like plants and monuments, living testimony to the possibility of endurance, to the power of patient growth, to the deep wisdom that comes from remaining rooted while the world transforms around you. And always, in their shadow, grew the next generation, saplings and seedlings that would not reach maturity for centuries, young trees that would witness changes these ancient ones could not imagine, carrying forward the genetic wisdom of their elders into climates yet to be born. Standing among such trees, Ice Age peoples must have experienced a different relationship to time itself, an awareness of their place in patterns larger than individual lives, a connection to continuity that stretched both backward toward origins and forward toward destinies they could not foresee. Even when these guardians finally fell after millennial growth, they continued their service to the forest community, becoming nurse logs that nourish new generations, their decomposing bodies providing the mineral foundation for forests yet to grow, their death becoming the raw material of future life. For months in the Ice Age North, the sun forgot to rise, and the world entered a darkness so complete, so profound, that it transformed the very nature of existence. Yet this was not empty darkness. This was a darkness of deep space made visible, the infinite cosmos revealed in all its terrible and beautiful immensity. In this endless night, the aurora borealis became not an occasional visitor but a constant presence, painting the sky in colors that seemed to emerge from dreams rather than physics. Green curtains rippled across the star-filled darkness like the visible breath of the planet itself, transforming the entire dome of sky into a living cathedral. When the moon rose, it illuminated a landscape transformed by darkness into something alien yet beautiful. Snow became silver, shadows became pools of deeper mystery, and the familiar world took on the quality of fever dreams, of visions, of landscapes that existed at the very edge of the possible. Life did not stop during these months of darkness, but adapted, evolved, found ways to thrive in conditions that seem hostile to consciousness itself. Arctic owls, their white feathers making them invisible against snow, hunted with hearing so acute they could locate mice moving beneath layers of powder. Wolves developed eyeshine so bright they seemed to carry their own light, amber stars moving through the darkness with predatory grace. The soundscape of polar night was unlike anything in our modern experience. Sounds carrying for incredible distances through air so still and cold it seemed crystallized. The crack of ice expanding, the whisper of wind across endless snow, the distant howl of a pack greeting the aurora, all combining into a symphony of solitude that spoke to something deep in the human psyche. Against this cosmic darkness, the fires of Ice Age peoples glowed like stars that had descended to Earth. Each flame was a victory over the fundamental hostility of their environment, a declaration that consciousness could persist even when the sun itself seemed to have abandoned the world. Around these fires, in the depths of polar night, storytelling became not entertainment but essential survival technology. Stories carried the compressed wisdom of generations, maps of meaning that help people navigate not just physical landscapes but psychological ones, finding power through darkness both external and internal. The stars in an Ice Age sky, unmarred by artificial light or atmospheric pollution, burned with an intensity that made navigation possible and wonder inevitable. Constellations seemed close enough to touch. The Milky Way stretched across the darkness like a river of scattered diamonds, and individual planets shone like beacons announcing the cosmic context of terrestrial existence. Time itself seemed to operate differently during polar night. Without the familiar rhythm of sunrise and sunset, consciousness had to find other anchors, the slow procession of stars across the sky, the waxing and waning of moon phases, the gradual shift in the aurora's patterns that marked the passage of weeks and months. Community became essential in ways we can barely imagine. Animals that might be solitary during other seasons gathered in groups that shared not just body heat but something approaching companionship. The darkness taught lessons about interdependence that the bright, individual-focused world of summer could not provide. And finally, after months that seemed like years, the first hint of returning light would appear on the southern horizon. Not sunrise yet, but the promise of sunrise, a suggestion that the world had not ended, that the cosmic cycle would continue, that darkness was not eternal but part of a larger pattern. When the sun finally returned, shadow and illumination, it seemed less like a daily event than a resurrection, less like weather than like miracle. The entire landscape seemed to exhale in relief, and even the most hardened survivors of polar night would find themselves moved to tears by the simple beauty of shadows returning to the world. Deep in the frozen soil of the Ice Age world, beneath layers of permafrost that seemed permanent as stone, lay the Earth's greatest investment in the future, millions upon millions of seeds, dormant but alive, waiting in suspended animation for conditions that might not return for thousands of years. Each seed was a masterpiece of biological engineering, a complete genetic library compressed into a package smaller than a grain of rice. Within these tiny capsules lay the blueprint for entire forests, the potential for grasslands that could feed herds of giants, the promise of flowers that would bloom in summers yet to be born. Inside each seed waited not just genetic information, but the compressed essence of adaptation itself. Thousands of years of evolutionary refinement that had taught these potential plants how to survive in conditions that would challenge the hardiest modern species. Each seed carried within it the wisdom of Ice Ages past and the flexibility to adapt to Ice Ages yet come. These seeds had traveled incredible distances to reach their resting places. Some had blown on continental winds, riding their current for hundreds of miles before settling into soil that would cradle them for millennia. Others had passed through the digestive systems of migrating animals, their tough seed coats allowing them to survive the journey and emerge in distant places enriched by natural fertilizer. In the permafrost, time became stratified like geological layers. Seeds from different eras lay at different depths, some from the beginning of the Ice Age, others from brief interglacial periods, each layer representing a different chapter in the Earth's climatic story, a different gamble on future conditions. For these seeds, patience was not a virtue but a survival strategy. They had evolved the ability to remain viable for periods that dwarf human civilizations. Their metabolism slowed almost to the point of stopping, their cellular processes suspended in a state that was neither life nor death but something in between. Yet even in dormancy, subtle processes continued. Repair mechanisms slowly fixed cellular damage, chemical signals monitored environmental conditions, and deep within each seed's genetic core, the potential for awakening remained intact, ready to respond to the precise combination of temperature, moisture, and light that would signal the return of favorable conditions. The diversity of these sleeping seeds was staggering. Some were adapted to the wet conditions that would follow glacial melting, others to the dry grasslands that would emerge as the climate warmed. Fast-growing pioneer species waited alongside slow-growing forest giants, each programmed to claim their particular niche in the post-glacial world. When the first subtle shifts in soil temperature began to signal the end of the Ice Age, these botanical time capsules started their ancient waking ritual. Chemical cascades triggered by temperature changes activated enzyme systems that had been dormant for thousands of years, beginning the slow transformation from potential to actual life. The emergence was not sudden but gradual. First a swelling as the seed absorbed moisture, then the first crack in the seed coat, then the tentative emergence of a root hair seeking nutrients in soil that was itself awakening from millennia of frozen sleep. These first plants to emerge in the post-glacial world were true pioneers, colonizing landscapes that had been locked in ice for tens of thousands of years. They transformed barren glacial till into living soil, creating the foundation for complex ecosystems that would follow. As warming continued and more seeds awakened, the post-glacial landscape became a laboratory of evolution in real time. Plants that had been separated by ice sheets for millennia were reunited, creating new hybrid possibilities and novel ecological relationships. Where plants led, animals followed. The awakening seeds called forth the return of herbivores, which brought predators, which attracted scavengers, creating a cascade of recolonization that transformed the sterile post-glacial landscape into thriving ecosystems within centuries. And as these awakened plants matured and began producing their own seeds, they continued the ancient cycle, creating new genetic combinations and dispersing them across the warming landscape, ensuring that future climate changes would find life ready to respond with the same patient adaptability. Many of the plants in our modern world are descendants of these Ice Age survivors. Their genetic code still carrying the cellular memory of those long years of dormancy, the deep knowledge of how to survive when the world itself seems to have ended, how to wait with infinite patience for the conditions that allow life to flourish once again. In the beginning, it was just a single drop, one molecule of water, liberated from its crystalline prison after millennia of frozen sleep, falling through still air to land on stone with a sound so small it seemed imaginary. Yet in that tiny splash lay the beginning of the end of an age, the first whisper of transformation that would reshape continents. The change was so gradual at first that it seemed like stillness. Glacial surfaces that had remained unchanged for thousands of years began to show the subtlest signs of alteration. Tiny pools of meltwater forming in slight depressions, streams no wider than fingers beginning to trace delicate patterns across ancient ice. Listen to the rhythm of change. Drip, drip, drip. Each drop a message from a warming world. Each splash a note in a growing symphony of transformation. The percussion was intermittent at first, then steady, then accelerating into a rhythm that spoke of forces too vast to resist. What began as whispers became conversations. What began as single drops became streams. What began as barely perceptible change became undeniable transformation. The ice, which had seemed permanent as mountains, revealed its true nature as frozen time, beginning its return to the flowing present. The melting was not uniform or constant, but followed seasonal rhythms amplified across decades. Each summer's thaw reached slightly high on the glacier's surface. Each winter's freeze was slightly less complete, creating a ratcheting pattern of change that compounded over centuries. Animals whose ancestors had lived with ice for hundreds of generations began to sense changes too subtle for human perception. Caribou altered migration routes that had been stable for millennia, following new possibilities opened by retreating ice. Bears explored valleys that had been closed by glacial advance of thousands of years. Where ice retreated, life advanced with startling speed. Seeds that had waited in frozen soil began to germinate, sending up shoots of green that seemed impossibly bright against the dark stone and glacial till. Within decades, areas that had been buried under ice for millennia bloomed with flowers that had not been seen in those places since before human memory. As glacier melted, they reorganized entire drainage systems. New rivers carved channels through landscapes that had known only ice, while glacial lakes formed in basins carved by the retreating ice. The very geography of continents began to shift as the weight of ice was lifted from the land. What had begun as imperceptible change gathered momentum with each passing century. Ice sheets that had advanced and retreated in geological time now began to retreat in historical time, their margins moving back at rates that could be observed within a single human lifetime. When retreating glacier reached the sea, their melting accelerated dramatically. Massive carving events sent icebergs the size of cities into waters that had not seen such spectacle for tens of thousands of years, creating temporary armadas of floating ice that carried the essence of ancient winters to distant shores. The water released by melting ice had to go somewhere, and that somewhere was the ocean. Sea levels began to rise with increasing speed, flooding coastal areas that had been exposed during the Ice Age, reconnecting islands to continents and continents to each other in ways that created new possibilities for migration and evolution. Entire landscapes that had been defined by ice began to take on new forms. Mountains that had been buried revealed themselves for the first time in millennia, while valleys carved by glacial flow became rivers and lakes. The post-glacial world was not simply the pre-glacial world restored, but something entirely new, sculpted by the patient work of ice and revealed by its departure. As melting accelerated, so did ecological change. Species that had been separated by ice for thousands of years were reunited, creating new evolutionary possibilities. Ecosystems that had been stable throughout the Ice Age suddenly found themselves in flux, adapting to conditions that changed faster than they had for hundreds of thousands of years. Each drop of meltwater carried with it the irreversible nature change. Once liberated from ice, water flowed toward the sea, taking with it a compressed history of millennia, dissolving the frozen archives of ancient climate into the democratic present of flowing rivers and rising seas. In the hardened mud of ancient lake shores, in the petrified sediments of rivers long dry, lie the most intimate records of Ice Age life, not the grand narratives of geological change, but the small, personal moments that speak across millennia with startling immediacy, footprints, fossil pollen, the preserved remains of individual lives live in a world so different from ours it might as well have existed on another planet. Here, pressed into stone with the precision of ancient pottery, is a footprint of an individual mammoth. Not simply evidence of the species, but the trace of one particular animal walking across muddy ground on one specific day perhaps 20,000 years ago. You can see the texture of its foot pad, the slight asymmetry that suggests it favored one side, the weight distribution that speaks of its age and size. And here, following the adult tracks with touching fidelity, are the smaller print of a young mammoth, staying close to its parent in the ancient equivalent of holding hands. This is not scientific data but family drama preserved in stone, a child learning to navigate its world by following in the footsteps of experience and wisdom. Most remarkable of all are the places where human footprints mingle with those of extinct animals, evidence of encounters between our ancestors and creatures that now exist only in our imaginations. Here, a human walked within hours of a giant ground sloth, their paths crossing in ways we can only guess at. Were they predator and prey, or simply two species sharing the same waterhole under the vast Ice Age sky? Trapped in the same sediments that preserve these footprints are microscopic time capsules, pollen grains and seeds that reveal with scientific precision the plant communities that supported these great animals. Each grain tells a story of seasons and weather patterns, of flowering times and pollination strategies, of an intricate web of relationships that supported some of the most magnificent fauna the world has ever known. Even the preserved dung of Ice Age animals, coprolites, has become treasure, revealing not just what these animals ate but how they lived. The content of a mammoth's digestive system can tell us about seasonal migrations, preferred food sources, even social behaviors as intimate as which individuals shared feeding grounds. In certain locations, entire family groups have been preserved together, mammoth mothers with calves, saber-toothed cats with their young, evidence of social structures and family bonds that survived the centuries as surely as bone and tooth. These are not scattered remains, but family portraits written in calcium and phosphate. Stone tools found in association with animal remains tell stories of successful hunts, of humans and megafauna locked in the eternal dance of predator and prey. But they also tell subtler stories, tools used for processing plant materials, evidence of humans as gatherers as well as hunters, participants in ecosystems rather than dominators of them. In the permanent frost of the far north, preservation sometimes reaches miraculous levels. Mammoth carcasses complete with fur, muscle, and even stomach contents are being discovered, giving us insight into Ice Age life that approached the intimacy of direct observation. We know what they ate for their last meal, what parasites they carried, even what diseases they suffered from. And in the caves where our ancestors sheltered, their artistic interpretations of this world have survived. Not just representations, but relationships, evidence of how Ice Age people saw their place in the community of life. These paintings suggest not dominion but kinship, not separation but participation in a world where humans and animals share both landscape and destiny. Modern science has allowed us to recover DNA from specimens tens of thousands of years old, giving us access not just to what Ice Age animals look like, but to their genetic relationships, their evolutionary histories, even their individual genealogies. We can trace family lines across millennia and reconstruct population movements with the precision of molecular archaeology. Every year, new discoveries add chapters to the stone library, a cache of tools in a previously unexplored cave, a new trackway revealed by erosion, animal remains in perfect preservation emerging from thawing permafrost. The Ice Age world continues to reveal itself to us, one fossil, one footprint, one ancient moment at a time. What makes these discoveries so compelling is their personal nature. These are not abstract data points, but individual stories. The last walk of a mammoth before it became trapped in a tar pit, the morning hunt of a saber-toothed cat preserved in stone, the family gathering of ground sloths around a water source on a day when the world was young. In these echoes in stone, we find not just a history of vanished worlds, but the continuity that connects us to them. The same forces that preserve these ancient moments continue to operate today, ensuring that our own footprints, our own stories, will someday speak across time to beings we cannot imagine, carrying forward the endless conversation between past and future that is written in stone and bone and the patient persistence of memory itself. We return now to where our journey began, this quiet countryside, these rolling hills, this familiar landscape that seemed so ordinary when we first encountered it. Yet everything has changed, not in the external world, but in our perception, in our understanding of the deep time that flows beneath the surface of the present moment. Look now with Ice Age eyes and see what was invisible before. These gentle hills are the work of glacier, carved by ice sheets that flowed like frozen rivers across landscapes that took millennia to sculpt. Every contour tells a story of advance and retreat, of ice and meltwater, of the patient architecture of geological time. These wildflowers that nod in the morning breeze are descendants of the Arctic plants that colonized the raw earth left by retreating glacier. In their genes flow the memories of conditions we can barely imagine, endless summers, winters that lasted for years, the chemical signatures of ancient atmospheres locked in cellular code. This stream follows a course carved by glacial meltwater. Its meanders and oxbow lakes the signature of waters that carry the dreams of ice sheets to distant seas. In its flow lies a continuation of processes that began when the world was young and ice first learned to reshape continents. The deer that graze in these fields are evolutionary cousins of species that shared the Ice Age world with mammoths and saber-toothed cats. In their cautious movements, their alert senses, their seasonal migrations, we see echoes of survival strategies refined across hundreds of thousands of years of life at the edge of ice. And we humans, builders of farms and cities, shapers of landscapes to serve our needs, we too are children of the Ice Age, our intelligence forged in the crucible of survival at the margins of habitability, our capacity for cooperation and planning developed through countless generations of winter survival, our dreams of warmth and abundance born from memories of cold and scarcity coded deep in our collective unconscious. Even the sky above carries echoes of Ice Age weather. Circulation patterns established by continental ice sheets still influence the paths of storms, the distribution of rainfall, the seasonal rhythms that govern agriculture and migration. The atmosphere itself remembers what our conscious minds have forgotten. Dig beneath the surface of any field and find a layered history of climate change, bands of sediment deposited during glacial advances, organic layer from brief warm periods, the compressed autobiography of a planet in constant, slow transformation. We walk on the ground bones of ice ages, our footsteps following paths carved by geological time. The same processes that created the Ice Age world continue around us every moment. Erosion and deposition, evolution and adaptation, the endless dance between ice and fire, water and stone, life and time. We are not separate observers of these processes, but participants in them. Our own brief lives part of patterns that connect the deep past to the distant future. The Ice Age is not truly ended, but merely paused, a temporary interglacial in a cycle that has repeated many times and will repeat again. The Milankovitch cycles that brought ice to our world continue their cosmic dance, promising that someday, perhaps in tens of thousands of years, perhaps sooner, the conditions will align again for ice sheets to advance, for grassland to support giants, for the world to once again become a place where patience is measured in millennia and change unfolds at the speed of stone. Our efforts to preserve wilderness areas, to protect endangered species, to understand and respond to climate change are informed by knowledge that comes ultimately from reading the records of Ice Age transformation. In learning to see deep time, we learn to take responsibility for the long-term consequences of our actions. The children who play in these fields are the latest chapter in a story that began before our species learned to dream. They carry within their cells the genetic wisdom of countless generations who survived ice ages, who adapted to changing climates, who learned that intelligence and cooperation could triumph over even the harshest conditions nature could devise. This morning light that illuminates a familiar landscape is the same light that shone on mammoth herds and saber-toothed cats, that painted aurora-filled skies over endless grasslands, that witnessed the slow retreat of ice sheets and the awakening of seeds that awaited millennia for their moment of germination. In the turning of seasons, in the migration of birds, in the blooming of flowers and the falling of leaves, we see the continuation of patterns established when the world was young and ice was king. These rhythms connect us not just to our own brief history, but to the vast cycles of planetary time that dwarf human civilizations and yet include us completely. As our journey through deep time draws to a close, we return to the profound truth with which we began. Beneath the surface of the ordinary lies the extraordinary. Beneath the familiar lies the miraculous. Beneath the present moment lies the eternal story of a world in constant, beautiful, patient transformation. In the silence of this morning hour, we can almost hear the whispers of deep time, the slow breathing of the earth, the patient advance and retreat of ice, the ancient songs of wind across grasslands that stretch beyond every horizon. We are part of this story, brief participants in patterns that began before consciousness and will continue long after memory. The Ice Age sleeps now in stone and memory, but it sleeps lightly, ready to wake when the cosmic cycles align, when the Earth's orbit shifts just enough to tip the balance from warmth to cold. Until that time, we carry within us the memories of ice, in our genes, in our dreams, in our deep knowledge that we are not separate from nature but part of it, children of ice and time in the eternal patience of stone. What was Earth like during the Ice Age? It was a world of giants and dreamers, of patience and transformation, of beauty so profound it continues to shape everything we are and everything we might become. It was a world not unlike our own, temporary, precious, and infinitely worth remembering. In those vast silences between glacier and grassland, between the howl of wind and the trumpet of mammoth, lay spaces large enough to hold all human wondering. The Ice Age was not just a chapter in Earth's climate history, but a meditation on what it means to endure, to adapt, to find beauty in the harshest conditions, to carry hope across spans of time that dwarf individual existence. The creatures of that world, mammoth and saber-tooth, giant sloth, and cave bear, were not merely animals but embodiments of different ways of being conscious, different relationships to time and space and survival. In their patient movements across landscapes larger than continents, they demonstrated that intelligence takes many forms, that wisdom often wears fur and moves on four legs, that consciousness is not the exclusive province of those who paint caves and kindle fire. Those who did paint caves and kindle fire, our ancestors, learned in the crucible of ice something we are still learning, that survival is not merely about the persistence of the individual, but about the continuation of something larger. They learned to read the subtle language of weather and season, animal track, and plant growth, to think not just in terms of the next meal or the next winter, but in terms of the knowledge they would pass to children, the paths they would mark for generations yet unborn. In their art, those handprints press against cave walls, those running animals painted by firelight. We see the first flowering of the uniquely human impulse to make meaning from existence, to transform the raw experience of survival into something approaching the sacred. They were the first to ask not just how do we live, but why do we live? What does it mean to be conscious in a universe of ice and stone and endless sky? The landscapes they inhabited were themselves teachers. The mammoth steppe, with its horizons that seemed to curve beyond the edge of the world, taught lessons about scale and proportion, about the relationship between the individual and the infinite. The great migrations they witnessed, rivers of life flowing across continents, demonstrated that existence gains meaning through participation in patterns larger than the self. The glacier themselves are perhaps the greatest teachers of all, embodying in their slow advance and retreat the fundamental truth that change is the only constant, that what seems permanent is merely persistent, that even the mightiest forces yield eventually to the patient pressure of transformation. In watching ice sheets grow and shrink across millennia, Ice Age peoples learned to think in geological time, to see themselves as part of processes that connected their brief lives to the deep history of the planet. The seasons of the Ice Age, winters that lasted years, summers compressed into weeks of frantic growth and reproduction, taught different relationships to time itself. In a world where change happened slowly, where adaptations accumulated across thousands of generations, patience was not just a virtue but a survival strategy. The ability to wait, to endure, to maintain hope across spans of time that would challenge modern sensibilities, became as important as any tool or weapon. Yet for all its harshness, the Ice Age world was also a world of profound beauty. The aurora painting nightly cathedrals across polar skies, the crystal architecture of glacial ice, the vast tapestries of flowers that bloomed in Arctic meadows. These were not accidents but expressions of fundamental principles, demonstrations that beauty is not a luxury added to existence but something woven into its very fabric. In the clear waters of glacial lakes, ancient people saw reflections not just of sky but of possibility. In the songs of wind across endless grasslands, they heard voices that connected them to weather systems spanning continents. In the dance of seasons, they found rhythms that helped them understand their place in cycles larger than individual lives, yet intimate enough to include their own breathing, their own heartbeats, their own brief passage through time. The Ice Age world was also a world of profound interconnection. The great herbivores shaped grasslands, which influenced weather patterns, which affected the advance and retreat of glacier, which carved landscapes, which provided habitat for countless species, which influenced the migrations that our ancestors followed, which shaped the development of human intelligence and culture. Nothing existed in isolation. Everything was connected to everything else in webs of relationships so complex they approached the sacred. Perhaps most importantly, the Ice Age world taught lessons about resilience that our modern world desperately needs to remember. Life persisted not through domination but through adaptation, not through resistance to change but through the patient development of strategies that could accommodate transformation. Species survived not by conquering their environment but by finding their niche within it, by developing relationships that sustained rather than depleted the systems that sustained them. The seeds that waited in frozen soil for millennia, the trees that marked centuries in their rings, the hibernating animals that mastered the art of conscious suspension, all demonstrated that survival sometimes requires the ability to pause, to wait, to trust in cycles larger than immediate understanding. They showed that endurance is not about fighting against the natural world, but about learning to dance with it, to find rhythms that allow persistence across changes that might otherwise prove catastrophic. As we face our own era of rapid climate change, the Ice Age offers both warning and hope. Warning that climate systems can shift with surprising speed once certain thresholds are crossed. That species and ecosystems that seem stable can collapse with startling suddenness when conditions change beyond their adaptive capacity. But also hope that life has survived previous transformations as dramatic as any we might face, that intelligence and cooperation can triumph over seemingly impossible odds, that consciousness itself may be the Earth's greatest experiment in adaptation. The children who play in modern meadows built on the bones of mammoths carry within their cells a genetic memory of Ice Age survival. They inherit not just the DNA of their ancestors, but the deep wisdom accumulated through hundreds of thousands of years of learning to live at the edge of the possible. In their laughter, their curiosity, their capacity for wonder, we hear echoes of the same qualities that allow their ancestors to find beauty in the harshest conditions, to make art in caves, to see in aurora-painted skies not just weather but magic. The story of the Ice Age is ultimately the story of consciousness learning to be at home in an unstable world, of intelligence developing not as a tool for domination but as capacity for relationship, for seeing connections across scales of space and time that challenge individual perception. It is the story of creatures learning to think not just in terms of their own survival, but in terms of the systems that make survival possible, the landscapes that shape them even as they shape those landscapes in return. In the fossil record, In the stone archives of ancient climate, in the genetic memories carried by modern species, the Ice Age continues to speak to us. Its voices are the voices of wind across tundra, of glacier carving into seas, of aurora dancing in skies so clear they seem to bring stars within reach of human hands. Its lessons are written in the patient script of adaptation, in the slow sentences of evolutionary change, in the persistent grammar of life finding ways to continue across conditions that test the very limits of possibility. The Ice Age reminds us that we are not separate from the natural world but expressions of it, not masters of Earth but participants in its ongoing experiment with consciousness. We are Ice Age minds in modern bodies, carrying within us the deep wisdom of ancestors who learned to read the subtle signs that mean the difference between thriving and merely surviving, who developed the capacity to find meaning and beauty even in the most challenging circumstances. Transform not just itself, but the very nature of what it means to be alive in a cosmos where ice becomes water, water becomes clouds, clouds become dreams, and dreams become the stories we tell ourselves about what it means to be human in a universe that somehow, against all odds, learned to love its own reflection in the brief, bright mirrors of conscious minds. The Ice Age whispers still in the morning wind, speaks still in the patient language of stone and stream, dreams still in the genetic memories we carry in ourselves. And we, its children, its inheritors, its living legacy, continue the ancient work of transforming survival into meaning, endurance into wisdom, existence into the endless, beautiful, patient dance of consciousness learning to be at home in an ever-changing world. This, then, was Earth during the Ice Age, a planet learning to dream, a world where consciousness first opened its eyes to beauty stark enough to be unforgettable, harsh enough to demand the development of new capacities for wonder, patient enough to teach the deepest lessons about what it means to persist with purpose across the vast, slow transformations that mark the passage of geological time on a world where ice and fire, silence and song, solitude and community all find their perfect expression in the endless, magnificent dance of life becoming aware of itself. And so the story continues, as it always has, as it always will, in the turning of seasons, the migration of herds, the patient growth of ancient trees, the silent flow of glacial rivers carrying the dreams of ice toward seas that hold the memories of all climates, all seasons, all the beautiful transformations that mark the endless conversation between matter and meaning on a planet where consciousness bloomed like spring flowers in the long winter of geological time, teaching us that we are not separate from the Ice Age world, but expressions of its deepest wisdom, carriers of its ancient dreams into futures bright with possibility and patient with the accumulated wisdom of ancestors who learned to find beauty at the very edge of survival itself, grew with the patience of trees, the persistence of mountains. The Laurentide ice sheet, which would eventually cover most of what we now call Canada and the northern United States, began as individual snowflakes falling on rocky ground. But over centuries, this humble beginning became a giant of ice 2 miles thick, a frozen mountain range flowing slowly across the continent like a river of crystallized time. These glaciers breathed with their own rhythm. They flowed like honey, carved valleys like sculptors, and moved mountains as if they were pebbles. Each ice sheet was a living entity, growing in winter, resting in summer, always flowing, always changing, always dreaming of the sea. Listen, can you hear it? The song of ice under pressure, the deep groans of a glacier settling into its slow dance with gravity. This is a voice of geological time made audible, patient, powerful, and profoundly peaceful. From the birth of these giants, our world would never be the same. They were sculptors working on a continental scale, architects of landscapes that still define our modern world. In their patient advance and eventual retreat, they carved the Great Lakes, sculpted fjords, and left behind the rolling hills and countless lakes that now cradle our cities and dreams. Beyond the ice, where the glacier influence softened into suggestion rather than dominion, stretched landscapes that exist now only in paleontologist reconstructions and the deepest chambers of genetic memory. The Mammoth Steppe, a grassland so vast it makes our Great Plains seem like garden plots. Picture, if you can, an ocean of grass stretching from what is now Western Europe across Siberia to Alaska and beyond. A single ecosystem larger than Africa, carpeted with herbs and sedges that fed giants. This was not the harsh, lifeless tundra we know today, but a rich, complex grassland bursting with life. Imagine meadows where every step might crush flowers that bloomed for mammoth eyes, where the air was so clean it hurt to breathe, where silence had texture and weight. Hey, summer days stretched endlessly toward horizons that seemed to curve away from time itself. The sun would roll around the sky like a golden wheel, never quite setting, painting the landscape in hues that shifted from gold to amber to rose to violet in a slow dance that lasted for months. And when winter finally claimed the land, the aurora borealis would paint cathedrals of light across the polar night. Green curtains of luminescence would ripple across the sky like the visible dreams of the earth itself, reflecting off endless fields of snow until the entire world seemed lit from within. The wind here told different stories than our modern breezes. It had traveled across thousands of miles of grass and ice, gathering the breath of glacier, the whispers of wildflowers, the distant songs of migrating herds. To breathe this air was to breathe the essence of a world where silence and space were not empty, but full of possibility. In these landscapes of dreams, distance became a meditation, horizon became hope, and every sunset was a promise that beauty could exist without witness, that majesty required no audience except the patient sky and the dreaming earth. In this world of endless grass and patient ice lived beings so magnificent that our modern world seemed diminished by their absence. The woolly mammoth, Mammuthus primigenius, was not merely an animal, but a walking meditation on what it means to be perfectly adapted to one's world. Look into those dark eyes and see depth that held the wisdom of hundreds of thousands of years. These were not primitive creatures struggling against their environment, but perfectly evolved beings who had learned to dance with the Ice Age to find abundance in apparent scarcity. Watch how they moved, not with the frantic energy of prey animals, but with the patient confidence of those who belong absolutely to their place and time. Every step was considered, every pause meaningful. They moved like living mountains, like prayers in motion across the sacred texts of the tundra. They lived in matriarchal societies led by the eldest females, repositories of seasonal wisdom and migration routes learned over decades. The grandmother mammoth knew where to find sweet grass when the winds turned cold, where to shelter when storms swept down from the glacier, where to find the clay licks that provided essential minerals. Their voices carried for miles across the still air, infrasonic rumbles that spoke of love, warning, and simple companionship. These conversations rippled across the steppe like stones thrown into still water, connecting family groups across vast distances in a social network that spanned continents. Their fur was not merely protection against the cold, but architecture, a complex system of guard hairs and downy undercoat that created microenvironments of warmth. Each hair was a small miracle of engineering, hollow and insulating, allowing these beings to remain comfortable in temperatures that would kill most modern mammals. That trunk, more versatile than our hands, more sensitive than our fingertips, could strip bark from a tree or pick up a flower with equal precision. With it, they could taste the air for weather patterns, caress their young with infinite tenderness, or dust themselves with protective earth. In their patient movements across landscapes larger than nations, they were more than animals. They were the living embodiment of an ancient contract between consciousness and place, a reminder that intelligence comes in many forms, and wisdom often wears a disguise of simple being. Water, in the Ice Age world, spoke in different tongues than our modern streams. These were not merely rivers, but arteries of the earth itself, carrying stories written in sediment and stone across continents and centuries. Follow this glacial river as it winds through valleys carved by its own ancient ancestors. See how the water moves with a different quality than rain-fed streams. Heavier, more purposeful, laden with the ground dreams of mountains and the liquid memories of ice. This milky blue color comes from glacial flour, rock ground so fine by the patient teeth of glacier that it remains suspended like powdered moonlight in the water. Each particle is a word in the Earth's autobiography, a microscopic testament to the slow, inexorable power of ice to reshape stone. Beneath the surface, the river carries secrets, tiny shells from creatures that live in seas millions of years old, fragments of mountains that once stood where valleys now flow, pollen from forests that bloomed and died before humans learned to dream. Where these rivers met the sea, they created deltas that pulse with life. Fresh, mineral-rich water mixed with salt to create nurseries for countless species. Massive salmon runs turned rivers silver with their abundance, and bays grew fat on the plenty these waters provided. Listen to the voice of glacial water. It speaks more slowly than mountain streams, with the deep patience of something that has traveled not just across space, but across time. This water once fell as snow on peaks that existed before mammals walked the earth. It has been ice, has been vapor, has been the very breath of clouds. Each drop carries within it the history of weather systems that covered continents, of pressure and temperature changes that shaped climate across eons. To drink from such a river was to taste geological time itself, to take into your body water that had been part of glacier and oceans, raindrops and tears. In their ceaseless flow toward the sea, these rivers of memory connected the frozen heart of the continent to the breathing waters of the ocean, weaving ice and sea into a single story of transformation, patience, and the eternal dance between solid and liquid, memory and change. Deep within the Earth's embrace, where stone roots reach down toward the planet's dreaming heart, our ancestors found something more than mere shelter. They found sanctuary, places where the human spirit could expand beyond the harsh mathematics of survival into something approaching the sacred. See these walls, painted not with pigments alone, but with dreams made visible. Each line drawn by fingers that knew cold and hunger, yet chose beauty over mere existence. These are not primitive scratchings, but sophisticated artistic expressions that speak across thousands of years with startling immediacy. This mammoth, painted in ochre and charcoal by the light of flickering torches, is not merely representation. It is invocation, prayer, a reaching across the species divide toward understanding. The artist knew this creature intimately, had watched it move, had perhaps touched its coarse fur, had looked into those dark eyes and seen something that demanded honoring. And these hands, pressed against cold stone and outlined in red ochre, speak to something profoundly human about the need to say, "I was here." Each print is a signature across time, a message from fingers that worked stone tools, gathered berries, comforted children, and reached toward beauty even in the harshest of circumstances. The acoustics of these caves were not accidental. Our ancestors chose these places partly for their sonic properties, spaces where the human voice could expand and resonate, where stories told around winter fires could echo off stone walls and take on the authority of the earth itself speaking. In the deepest chambers, accessible only by crawling through narrow passages, the paintings become more mysterious, more shamanic. Here, in darkness so complete it had weight, initiate perhaps experience visions that bridge the world of waking and the realm of dreams. Imagine the cave illuminated only by fire, shadows dancing, paintings seeming to move and breathe in the flickering light. In such places, the boundary between representation and reality became permeable. The painted animals seemed alive, seemed ready to step from stone into flesh. These caves were universities of the spirit, libraries written in pigment and shadow, places where consciousness itself seemed to expand beyond the individual into something tribal, something eternal. In their depths, humanity learned not just to survive the Ice Age, but to transform through the alchemy of imagination into something approaching the sacred. Even in the depths of the Earth's longest winter, life found ways not merely to endure, but to celebrate. In the seeming wasteland of the periglacial zone, where glacier had sculpted the land and departed, leaving behind raw stone and infant soil, botanical miracles unfolded with quiet persistence. Arctic poppies, their petals thin as whispers yet bright as prayers, turned their faces to follow the endless summer sun. Each flower was an act of defiance against the tyranny of cold, a declaration that beauty could flourish where logic suggested only endurance was possible. Moss campion, growing in cushions so dense they created their own microclimates, transforming cracking rocks into gardens. These plants were not merely survivors but architects, their root systems breaking down stone grain by grain, creating soil where none existed, preparing the way for forests that would not arrive for millennia. Mountain avens spread their white faces toward the sky like stars fallen to earth. Their leaves, small and practical, harbored magic, the ability to extract nitrogen from the air itself, enriching the sterile glacial soils with the chemistry of life. From a distance, these communities of tiny plants created tapestries of color that stretched to horizons, purple saxifrage, yellow Arctic buttercups, and the deep rows of fireway creating impressionist masterpieces that no human eye witnessed, painted for the pure joy of existing. And where flowers bloomed, life multiplied. Bees, thick-bodied and fur-covered to retain warmth, moved among the blossoms with the focused intensity of creatures who knew summer was brief and precious. Their humming was the sound of life concentrated, distilled into moments of perfect purpose. Arctic butterflies, their wings patterned in browns and oranges that echoed the tundra itself, danced between flowers in flights that seemed too delicate for such a harsh world. Yet they thrived here, their life cycle precisely timed to match the brief window when nectar flowed and warmth allowed for transformation. In these communities of botanical survivors, we see reflected something profound about life itself, that the impulse toward beauty, toward flowering, toward offering sweetness to the world, persists even in conditions that strip existence down to its most essential elements. These flowers were not merely adapted to the Ice Age, they were its poetry made visible, its hope made manifest in petal and leaf. In the borderlands where ice gave way to forest, where glacial winds softened into something approaching warmth, there walked a predator so perfectly evolved for its time that it seems mythical now, Smilodon fatalis, the saber-toothed cat, carrying in its very bones a story of what it means to be supremely, precisely, fatally adapted. Those sabers were not weapons of brute force, but surgical instruments evolved for a specific task. Each tooth was a blade honed by millions of years of evolutionary refinement, designed to deliver death with an efficiency that bordered on the merciful. To understand these teeth is to understand that nature's violence often wears a disguise of perfection. Watch how it moves, not with the liquid grace of modern cats, but with a different kind of precision. Heavier in the shoulders, built for power rather than speed, it hunted not through chase but through patience, stealth, and the explosive application of overwhelming force. This was a world of edges, where forest met grassland, where herds of massive herbivores created opportunities for predators who could read the landscape like a book. The saber-tooth was fluent in this language of transition zones, of seasonal movements, of the eternal dance between hunter and hunted. Its ears, constantly moving, collected intelligence from a soundscape richer than our modern world can imagine. The distant trumpet of a mastodon, the warning call of ground sloths, the rustle of giant beavers by a stream. Each sound was data to be processed, opportunity to be evaluated. In those eyes burned an intelligence we can barely fathom. Not the broad, adaptable intelligence of humans, but something more focused, more purely functional. This was consciousness distilled to its essence, the ability to read the subtle signs that meant life or death in a world where there were no second chances. It moved through landscapes that were themselves transitional, boreal forests pushing south during glacial advances, temperate woodland creeping north during warmer interludes. The saber-tooth was a creature of these borderlands, equally at home in snow and under summer leaves. From elevated positions, it would survey territories that span hundreds of square miles, reading the stories written in game trails and water sources, in the seasonal movements of prey animals whose ancestors had played this game of survival for hundreds of thousands of years. In its patient stillness, the saber-tooth embodied something we have lost, the ability to be completely, utterly present to a single moment, to a single purpose. Its entire being was an arrow drawn on the bow of evolution, aimed at targets that existed in the specific ecological moment of the Ice Age world. Above the Ice Age world stretched skies that would leave modern observers breathless with wonder. With no cities to scatter light, no industrial haze to dim the stars, the night sky was an ocean of luminescence that made navigation possible and dreams inevitable. The aurora borealis painted itself across polar nights with an intensity we can scarcely imagine. These were not the brief, elusive curtains of light we occasionally glimpse today, but nightly performances that lasted for hours, transforming the entire dome of sky into a living cathedral of green and gold and rose-colored fire. Against the white canvas of snow-covered tundra, the aurora created a complete universe of light. Above and below, heaven and earth united in luminescence. Imagine walking across such landscapes, your path lit by cosmic fire, your footsteps the only sound in a world made entirely of light and silence. Meteor showers, unmarred by atmospheric pollution, traced silver calligraphy across the stellar darkness. Each falling star was visible from horizon to horizon, and on the best nights, they fell like rain, as if the very sky were weeping light onto the patient earth. The Milky Way, our own galaxy seen edge on, stretched across the night like a river of scattered diamonds. So clear was it that individual star clouds were visible to the naked eye, and the great spiral arms of our cosmic home could be traced from horizon to horizon. But perhaps even more spectacular were the sunrises and sunsets in this transparent atmosphere. Without dust or pollution to scatter the light, the sun appeared to burn with the intensity of a cosmic forge, painting the sky in colors that had no names because no living eye had adequate word for such beauty. On clear winter mornings, the sun might appear as a perfect disbalance on the horizon for what seemed like hours, neither rising nor setting but simply being, like a meditation on the nature of light itself. Ice crystals suspended in the frigid air created optical phenomena that transformed ordinary daylight into magic. Sundogs, halos, pillars of light that rose from the horizon like bridges between earth and sky. The atmosphere itself became a lens, a prism, a kaleidoscope that turned weather into art. Under such skies, consciousness itself must have expanded. Without artificial light to create the illusion of separation from the cosmos, Ice Age humans lived in constant awareness of their place in the universe. They were citizens not just of Earth, but of the galaxy, witnesses to the cosmic drama that played out above their heads every night. In such clarity, such vastness, the human spirit could expand beyond the daily concerns of survival into contemplation of the eternal. These were skies that made philosophers of hunters, mystics of gatherers, and poets of anyone who paused long enough to look up and wonder. In forests where giant sequoias cast shadows that had witnessed the rise and fall of mountain ranges, there lived creatures so unhurried in their approach to existence that they seemed to move in a different relationship to time itself. The giant ground sloths, Megatherium, Eremitherium, were meditation made manifest, patience given form and weight. Look into that face and see something we have lost in our modern world, the profound peace that comes from being perfectly synchronized with one's environment, from having no need to hurry, no anxiety about tomorrow, no regret about yesterday. This was consciousness reduced to its essence, simply being moment by moment, breath by breath. Each movement was considered purposeful, economical. When a ground sloth reached for a branch, it was not merely feeding. It was performing a kind of moving meditation, each gesture flowing naturally from the one before, like postures in eternal yoga that lasted a lifetime. Those claws, which might seem fearsome to our eyes, were tools of peace, perfectly designed for their vegetarian lifestyle, for pulling down branches heavy with nutritious leaves, for digging roots that provided sustenance through long winters. They were instruments of survival that never knew violence. When resting, they became part of the landscape itself, therefore growing algae that camouflaged them among the mossy trunks, their stillness so complete that they seemed more like living boulders than animals. In such moments, the boundary between creature and environment dissolved entirely. Their breathing matched the rhythm of the forest itself, slow, deep, connected to seasonal cycles rather than moment-to-moment anxieties. To watch a giant sloth breathe was to witness a different relationship to time, one measured in seasons rather than seconds. They lived in small family groups, multi-generational units, where knowledge was passed not through language but through observation, through the slow apprenticeship of watching elders navigate the world with perfect economy of movement and effort. Young sloths learned by mimicking, their movements gradually acquiring the measured pace of their elders. There was no hurry to this education, no anxiety about keeping up. Each lesson was absorbed at the perfect rate, integrated completely before moving on to the next. In their unhurried passage through landscapes that existed on similar timescales, the giant ground sloths embodied a philosophy we have forgotten, that not everything we're doing needs to be done quickly, that patience is not emptiness but fullness, that the slowest movements often cover the greatest distances. They remind us that consciousness comes in many forms, and that perhaps our modern obsession with speed and efficiency has cost us something essential, the ability to move through life with the measured grace of those who know they belong completely to their place and time. In a world where human voices were rare and cities did not exist, the wind was a primary storyteller, carrying news across continents, bearing the breath of glacier to prairies, the scent of distant mountains to coastal plains, weaving the entire planet into a single, breathing conversation. Born in the frigid heart of continental ice sheets, these winds began their journey across the landscape, carrying the crystalline essence of deep cold, the metallic taste of air that had touched nothing but ice for hundreds of miles. Listen to the vocabulary of Ice Age wind. The sharp whistle across glacial crevasses, the deep moan through valleys carved by ancient rivers, the gentle susurrus through grasslands so vast they made their own weather systems. These winds were libraries in motion, carrying genetic information between plant populations separated by thousands of miles. Pollen from Arctic willows might travel south to fertilize relatives at the edge of the great forests, while seeds from temperate plants rode warm currents north to colonize newly ice-free ground. During dry seasons, great dust storms would rise from exposed glacial sediments, carrying mineral-rich particles across continents. This was not environmental destruction, but a vast recycling system, transporting nutrient from the ground bones of mountains to enrich soils thousands of miles away. In regions beyond the ice, persistent winds sculpted landscapes with infinite patience, creating dune fields and lush deposits that would become some of the world's most fertile soils. Each grain of sand was a traveler, each dust mote a messenger carrying story from distant places. For migrating animals, these wind patterns were highways through the sky. Birds learned to read the subtle pressure changes that indicated favorable conditions, riding updrafts and jet streams in journeys that spanned continents with an efficiency that modern aircraft can barely match. Where the wind encountered obstacles, rock formations, canyons, the scattered bones of mastodons, it created music. Natural wind instruments scattered across the landscape produced symphonies that played to audiences of grass and stone, compositions that changed with the seasons and the shifting patterns of ice advance and retreat. The acoustic landscape of the Ice Age was primarily the wind's domain. Sometimes a whisper that barely stirred the grass, sometimes a howl that announced the approach of weather systems spanning half a continent. It was a voice of the planet itself, unfiltered by human construction or machine noise. And on still days, when the wind held its breath, sound carried for incredible distances across the empty landscape. The trumpet of a mammoth might echo for miles. The howl of a dire wolf could reach across entire valleys, creating a communication network that connected creatures across vast distances. Even today, in certain places at certain times, you can still hear echoes of those ancient winds, the particular way air moves across grassland, the specific sound of weather changing over ice. The wind remembers what we have forgotten, carries in its patterns a genetic memory of a world where silence had weight and distance had meaning. In chambers deep beneath the earth, where temperature remained constant regardless of the seasons raging above, some of evolution's greatest success stories practice the ancient art of conscious dreaming, reducing existence to its most essential elements: breath, heartbeat, and the slow, patient metabolism of hope. The short-faced bear, Arctodus simus, was perhaps the largest terrestrial carnivore that ever lived, yet in hibernation it demonstrated something profoundly peaceful about the relationship between power and restraint. Here was a creature that could kill a bison with a single swipe of its paw, now reduced to something as gentle as breathing frost in the darkness. Look at this face in repose and see something that transcends species, the profound trust required to surrender consciousness a month at a time, to reduce metabolism so dramatically that life becomes little more than a flickering candle flame in the cosmic darkness. Each breath comes so slowly it seems the bear might have stopped breathing altogether, yet this apparent stillness masks incredible biological sophistication. The hibernating bear's body becomes a closed system, recycling proteins, maintaining bone density without movement, keeping vital organs functional at the absolute minimum energy cost. These caves were more than shelters, they were cocoons of transformation. In the absolute darkness and constant temperature, hibernating bears entered a state that was neither fully conscious nor unconscious, but something else entirely, a kind of biological meditation that allowed consciousness to persist at levels we can barely imagine. During these months of suspended animation, the bear's dreams, if we can call them dreams, likely operated on geological timescales. Perhaps they dreamed the slow dreams of mountains, the patient thoughts of rivers, the cyclical meditations of seasons passing overhead like distant weather. The bear was not alone in these subterranean sanctuaries. Other creatures had discovered the same solution to winter's harsh mathematics. Ground squirrels curled in balls so tight they seemed like furry stones, bats hanging in clusters that looked like strange fruit, all of them practicing the same art of conscious minimalism. Above, entire seasons played out their dramas, blizzards that lasted weeks, brief summers that painted the world green, autumn migrations of creatures following routes older than human memory. Yet here, in the Earth's embrace, time had a different quality, moving not in days or weeks but in the slow rhythm of a heart beating perhaps once per minute. As the world above began its slow turn toward spring, something deep in the bear's biology sensed a change, but not through some more fundamental connection remained constant rhythms. The heart began to beat slightly faster, the breathing deepened almost imperceptibly. And when those eyes finally opened after months of dreaming, they held something we can only imagine, the deep wisdom that comes from having touched the edge of existence and returned, from having practiced the ultimate surrender and been reborn into warmth and light. The emergence from hibernation was not sudden but gradual, like the dawn itself, consciousness returning in waves, the body slowly remembering its full power and presence. This was resurrection in its most literal sense, a return from a death so complete it made spring seem like the first morning of the world. In the cupped hands of glacially carved valleys lay lakes so pure, so perfectly still, that they seemed less like bodies of water than windows into another dimension, places where the boundary between sky and earth dissolved into perfect, crystalline unity. These glacial lakes held water that was more than mere H2O. It was liquid time, liquid memory, holding within its molecular structure the compressed stories of snowflakes that had fallen decades or centuries before, slowly melting from the heart of ancient ice. Peer beneath the surface and discover clarity that seems impossible to our modern eyes, accustomed as we are to waters clouded with sediment and human influence. Hey, you could see to depth that seemed to stretch toward the center of the earth, where ancient logs lay preserved like sleeping giants on the lake floor. In these pristine waters lived fish that knew no predators except the occasional bear or the rare human hunter. They moved with a different quality than modern fish, slower, more contemplative, as if they too were influenced by the profound stillness of their environment. Throughout the long summer days, these lakes served as cosmic mirrors, reflecting not just the sky above but the entire dome of existence. At sunrise, they caught fire with reflected light. At noon, they became windows of blue so deep it seemed you could fall through them into infinite sky. At midnight, they cradled stars like scattered diamonds. As winter approached, ice would begin to form from the edges inward, creating patterns of crystalline geometry that seemed more like art than physics. The expanding ice sang, high, musical notes that carried across the valley like the planet's own bell choir. When fully frozen, these lakes became vast mirrors of snow, indistinguishable from the surrounding landscape except for their perfect flatness. Animals would cross them unknowingly, walking across depths that could swallow trees, their tracks the only evidence that liquid water waited beneath the frozen surface. The spring thaw was a resurrection that took weeks or months. It began with a sound of dripping, single drops falling from warming ice into the liquid darkness below. Gradually, the percussion increased until the entire lake sang with the music of its own liberation. As the ice retreated, the lake's edge became a gathering place for all manner of life. Mammoths would wade into the shallows, their reflections wavering in concentric circles. Saber-toothed cats would approach cautiously, their golden eyes scanning both the water and its perfect reflection for signs of movement. From above, these lakes appeared as jewels scattered across the landscape by some cosmic hand, emeralds and sapphires and diamonds of liquid light, each one a meditation on stillness, on reflection, on profound beauty that emerges when water finds perfect peace. And when a single fish rose to feed, or a breath of wind touched the surface, the entire reflected world would shimmer and dance, reminding any observer that even the most perfect stillness contains within it the seeds of constant, subtle change. At the southern margins of the ice, where glacial winds softened into something approaching warmth, grew forests that were libraries of living time, ancient communities of trees that held within their rings a compressed wisdom of centuries, the recorded memory of every season, every drought, every abundance. Read these rings like pages in the Earth's autobiography, narrow bands marking years when cold lingered late into summer, wide rings celebrating seasons of perfect balance, the occasional scar where fire or wind wrote its signature across the growing wood. These were not merely trees but monuments, some having begun their life before the ice sheets reached their maximum extent, witnesses to the slow dance of climate change played out across millennia. A single ancient spruce might have lived through 50 human generations, its patient growth marking time in a rhythm completely divorced from human urgency. The voice of such a forest was unlike anything in our modern world, deeper, richer, carrying harmonic frequencies that resonated in the chest like cathedral organ tones. When wind moved through these giants, the entire forest became a musical instrument, playing compositions that lasted for hours and reached audiences of stone and snow. Beneath the cathedral canopy flourished ecosystems within ecosystems, gardens of moss so thick you could sink to your knees, ferns that had found their perfect niche in the filtered light, berry bushes that provided essential nutrients to creatures ranging from bays to ground squirrels. Through these groves flowed streams that carried more than water. They transported the forest breath, its dissolved minerals, its chemical communications. Trees along riverbanks would release compounds into the water that could be read by downstream forests like letters in a botanical postal system. The animals of these forests moved with a different quality than creatures of open spaces. They were adapted not just to cold but to the complex three-dimensional environment of the forest, comfortable moving through vertical space, reading the subtle signs that indicated safe passage through the maze of trunks and branches. The seasons here operated on a different schedule than in temperate regions. Summer was brief but intense, a burst of growth and reproduction compressed into a few precious months. Winter was a dominant season, lasting so long that it seemed less like a season than a way of being. When snow fell in these forests, it created architecture, great drifts sculpted by wind and branch into forms that seemed designed by conscious intention. The trees themselves became sculptures, their familiar forms transformed into abstract art by the patient accumulation of countless flakes. Even in death, these giants continued their service to the forest community. Fallen trees became nurse logs, their decomposing were providing nutrients and growing medium for new generations. Death and life intertwined so completely that the boundary between them became meaningless. From above, these forests stretched beyond every horizon, an ocean of green that covered continents, a single ecosystem so vast it influenced global weather patterns, generated its own precipitation, and created oxygen on a scale that affected the composition of the entire planet's atmosphere. Yet for all their continental scale, these forests were composed of intimate moments. The precise angle at which a branch emerged from a trunk, the exact spot where a seedling found sufficient light to begin its centuries-long journey toward the canopy, the particular quality of light that filtered through needles green with the accumulated wisdom of countless seasons. In this world of ice and endless distance lived the most remarkable creatures of all, beings who possessed neither mammoth strength nor saber-tooth ferocity, yet who not only survived but thrived through intelligence, cooperation, and an almost mystical ability to read the subtle language of land and weather. Watch these hands, scarred by cold and woke, yet capable of creating tools of startling sophistication. Each flint blade was not merely functional but beautiful, shaped with an aesthetic sense that suggests these people understood that survival itself could be a form of art. See how they moved together without apparent command structure, each person knowing instinctively their role in the ancient choreography of survival. Building shelter was not work but ritual, each hide placed with ceremonial precision, each support bone positioned according to knowledge passed down through hundreds of generations. The education of children was not formal but constant. Every moment a lesson, every action a teaching opportunity. A child learned to read weather signs not through explanation but through watching an elder's face as they scan the horizon, learning to trust instinct refined over millennia. Around fires that were literal lifelines against the cold, families shared not just food but stories, knowledge, the compressed wisdom of their ancestors. Each tale was both entertainment and curriculum, containing within its narrative structure the essential information needed for survival. Their clothing was engineering as much as art, layered systems of fur and hide that created micro-environments of warmth, garments so perfectly adapted to their environment that they enabled human life in conditions that would kill modern people within hours. They moved across the landscape, reading a text written in animal tracks, plant distribution, wind patterns, and the subtle signs that indicated water, shelter, or danger. Their literacy was not in symbols on parchment, but in the living language of the earth itself.